Welcome back! If you're new to this series, this is a two-part video where we're going to go over how to set up a party quest dungeon in MapleStory Worlds. If you haven't already, I'd suggest watching part 1 prior to this video. Last time, we've set up all of our server-side behavior that has to do with map management with dynamic maps. This time, we'll set up our UI and client-side behavior to call those functions. As mentioned in the last video, the project files for this project can be found in the description below. Let's begin. We've set up our server-side functions for our map generation and our party management for both inside of our scene management as well as inside of our dynamic map info. Let's now go into the client-side stuff. So let's set up our UI. As mentioned more in the beginning of this tutorial, I mentioned that I already set up my boss battle party UI here, and this is just a copy of our basic pop-up 2 from this UI template, and I've duplicated this and just modified just a little. I've added just a sprite and some text and then 2 buttons down here, and that's really it. The other thing that you'll notice is that the UI that's normally here on this left side, let me hide this here, no longer exists in our duplicated copy. And the reason for that is because inside of this list, let's go into our slot scroll here. This is a scroll layout group component, and I've essentially just deleted this and I've created it as a model. So what we're going to do is we're going to spawn this into our slot scroll. Let's place the hierarchy and let's drop this in here. And every time the user reserves or enters into the party, we're just going to pop this in. It's going to automatically format this for us. So we're going to do this through script. And we're just going to create this model as a child of the slot scroll for every member in the party that is ready to battle this Yeti. And then someone's going to click on the enter button and everybody that's in the party is going to enter into the boss battle. So let's hide this. Sorry, I'm going back just a little bit. And we'll also notice inside of the instance dungeon reservation UI, we have a couple properties. We have one, the reference to the model. So if you right click this and click copy entry ID, that is what is being utilized here. We also have references to the slot scroll parent. We'll have a reference to the register button, the close button up here, and then the enter button right here. So we're going to hook all 3 of these buttons up to behaviors, and we're going to see how to do that. Closing this, let's hop out of our UI edit mode, and let's first create some events here. So we're going to right click, let's create a folder and name this events, and let's create 2 events. So the first one we're going to do is let's create an event type, and we'll name this player registered event. So this is going to be an event for whenever the player registers using the register button right there, whenever the player clicks this button here. So that's when we're going to use this player registered event. So if you double click to open this, we're going to create 2 properties. The first one is going to be of type string and it's going to be user ID. The second one is going to be a boolean of registered. So first we're going to notify the server of who actually registered. And the second one is going to be used to flag whether the user is currently registered and should be unregistered, meaning we're kind of toggling on and off based on this value here. So if this is false, then we're going to toggle the user registration status to true. If the user is already registered, meaning if this is already true, then we're going to toggle the registration status to off. So this will be very important in that logic. The second event we're going to create, so we'll right click under the UI folder and we're going to create another event. And this time we're going to name this enter dungeon event. And we're actually going to leave this completely blank, but the only thing we're going to use for this is to notify when the user clicks the button for entering this dungeon. So when somebody clicks on this button, we're going to notify that this button has been clicked, and we're going to handle that behavior inside of our portal management script. So let's go into our instance dungeon UI, instance dungeon reservation UI. We'll double click this and we can see that we have those properties down here. We've already reviewed what this is. The only thing we're going to look at is the reservation list items. So this is going to keep a list of our items that we've created for our slot scroll. So if you double click on a reservation UI item, I'm going to double click this, and we're going to take a look at what's part of this here. And this is just going to be that model for this here. And we can see that we have the instance dungeon reservation UI item attached as a component to this UI. So here we're just going to have a reference to the text that's inside of this model. And then we're going to have an init function to initialize the value of the text to the user ID. We're also going to have a show and hide that will enable and disable the entity status. So with that, let's create our show function. So this will just be a show function. And we'll of course make sure that this is a client side. So execution space setting, we'll set this to client. And we're going to pass in a table of our user IDs. So table of the user IDs. So whenever the user ID is updated from our server side in scene management, remember we send an event, send reservation event, and we pass in the table of our users. Our UI is going to listen for that event, and we'll define that in just a moment. And based on the value of that table, we're going to update this user ID. So we're going to update all of these information, the user ID information that's going to populate on the left side of our UI here. And for each of those users, we're going to create the user ID model underneath the slot scroll. So here we are going to loop through all of the user IDs, and we're going to get or create the reservation item. So this is going to be kind of a object pooling logic here for our reservation list item. So if it's already been created, then we're going to just get that slot instead of destroying it every time. Otherwise, we're going to create a new one. So let's take a look at that function in just a moment. But assuming that we have grabbed our new item and set that as a child of the slot scroll parent, we can get the username based on the user ID. So we're going to get the users from the user ID and grab the nickname. So this will give us the user ID. And then we're going to call the init function to set the user ID text to the slot. And then we're going to call show on the item so that we activate that item. So as long as the number of reservations items is greater than 0, meaning that we've already at some point in the past created a couple slots, and then we're going to loop through each one, starting from our created list items pointer. So initially it's going to start at 1, but each time you create an item, it's going to increase by 1. So if we do, then we're going to end at the point of the end of this user ID table. So after that, we're going to hide any user IDs that's greater than the reservation list items table. So let's actually define this function here, and this will be named get or create reservation item. And we're going to return the component of instance dungeon reservation UI item. For the logic here, we're just going to grab the same pointer that we defined up here. We're going to set this as 1 initially, and then we're going to grab this pointer again, and we're going to get the reservation list items table based on the current pointer index. So this would of course be 1 when it first starts. And then if that item does not exist, we're going to spawn the reservation UI item model underneath the reservation scroll parent, which will be this. And we're going to grab the instance dungeon reservation UI item script. So it'll be this script here from that model. Then we're going to insert that item into the reservation list items table. And then we're going to increase the pointer by 1. And then we're going to set the pointer variable to the new value. Finally, we're going to return this item so that we can initialize it and show it. So if we have a show function, we of course need to have a hide function. So we're going to do hide here. And again, we're going to make sure that both of these are client-side functions. So let's set both of these as client-side functions. And in our hide function, first thing we're going to do is we're going to disable this entity. We're going to take a look at what this private variable is doing in just a moment. But if the player is already registered, then we're going to send the player registered event so that we can toggle off the player. So remember, in our event, inside of our player registered event, we have a registered boolean that's going to set the current state of player registration. If it's true, then we're going to toggle it to false. If it's false, then we're going to toggle the player registration to true and add the player to the party. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to send the player registration event so that the server can toggle it off. So let's actually define the player registration event. So we're going to set this as another client-side event, and we're going to name this player registered. And let's take a look at the logic in here. So again, we're going to grab the isRegistered Boolean private variable, and we're going to assign that to the registered variable. We're also going to grab the user ID of the local player and add that to the event. And we're just going to send that along to the local player. So whenever we listen in on this event, we're going to have to listen in on the local player. Now that we have that, let's first define the onBeginPlay function. This will be client side, so we're going to set the execution space setting to client only. And in here, we're going to do some initialization logic. First, we're going to set the reservation list items to an empty table. We've already kind of initialized up here inside of our property definition, but it's good to make sure that it's properly initialized and onBeginPlay. And then we're going to connect our button register. So this will be the register button over here. We're going to connect that to our player register function. So whenever the player clicks on this button, the registration button, we're going to send this event so that the server can listen in on this event. And then if the player is already registered, then we're going to unregister him. Otherwise, if it's not registered yet, we're going to toggle the registration so that we register the player. So we're going to kind of use this as a toggle. For the button enter, we're going to simply call our enter dungeon function, which is going to do the same thing. We're just going to send an event, and it's just going to notify that some player has clicked on the enter dungeon, and we're going to move all the registered players into the dynamic map. We're also going to connect our button close. So in our button close, we're going to call our hide function. And it's just going to close our UI, and it's going to unregister the player because we're closing this UI and we've chosen not to enter this dungeon. The final thing we're going to do is we're going to update the registration status to false. So we're going to set this isRegistered Boolean to false initially. So let's define both of these here. Let's first define our enter dungeon function. So first let's enter dungeon. So again, this is the function that we use to notify that some player has clicked the enter button and is ready to enter into the map. So this will just be a simple event with no separate parameters or variables to assign, and we're going to send that event to the local player. Then we're going to call update register to false because now we have entered the dungeon and we're no longer registering, we are now entering into the dungeon. And then we will create the update registered function, update registered. We're going to set this as a client-side function, and we'll copy this logic in right here. And we're going to add a parameter of string, and we're going to name this isRegistered. So we're going to pass in the new registration status, and then we're going to update the button register's text component to leave party or search party. Whether or not the value is toggled on or off is going to define whether the value says leave party or whether the value says search party. Then we're going to set the Boolean status of our private variable to isRegistered. Let's just press space here just so that we... Oops, sorry, this should not be string. This should be Boolean. My apologies. And now we have all the functions that we need. The final thing that we forgot to do is the actual event. So remember, where our show function takes in a table of our user IDs. So our scene management sends this event of the users. After we've reserved our dynamic map, it sends this event to update all the players that are currently reserved to update their UI with the new list of users. We have to listen in on this event. So here we're sending this event to self. So that would be the scene management logic script here. What we need to do is let's listen on the dynamic map reserved events, because that is actually the event that is being sent here, dynamic map reserved event. And we're just going to need this user table here. Taking a look at our logic, we're going to grab the user ID based on the local player's user ID, and we're going to check if the user contains the local user. So if the local user that received this event is in the table that was sent, we're going to set the isRegistration status to that value. So if my local user ID does not exist within this user table, that means I have been unregistered, right? Or if it exists, then that means I am registered. So regardless, we're going to update our registration status based on whether or not my local user is within this user's table that's been sent. And we're going to update this registration status and update the text to leave party or search party depending on our new status. Then we're going to check if our current reservation UI is enabled. If it is, then we're going to show the event users, meaning that we're going to update our users. We're going to update our reservations, meaning we're going to update our users that we see on the left side panel here with the new list of users that's passed by this event. If I am registered, then we're going to do that. If we're not registered, then we're just going to empty out this panel here on the left side. So we don't want anything to show if we're not registered. Only after we've registered do we want to see the users that I've been assigned to, so the party that I've been assigned to. So if I'm not registered, we're just going to do that by passing in an empty table and emptying out the left side panel. Okay, so something we actually forgot is inside of the handle dynamic reserved event that we defined, we have to make sure that we're listening in on the proper service. So when this is being sent, this is sent from our scene management, and we are calling dynamic map reserved event, and we're sending that to the self. So we have to listen in on the scene management here. So instead of self, we're going to change this to a logic script, because this is a logic script type, and we're going to set that to scene management. So this will listen in on the proper type and actually listen in on wherever this event is being sent to, which is going to, of course, be scene management that we defined here. And that is everything from our UI. The next thing that we want to do is we don't want to directly reference this UI. Let's say we're calling this from some sort of component. We want to have a separate bridge that we can call UI events to. So what we're going to do is inside of common, we're going to create another logic script. And let's name this UI manager. If we double click to open this, we're going to add three functions. The first one is going to be show pop up, and this will be a client-side function. We're going to add a variable. Normally this function would be used to show a pop-up, but in this case, we're simply just going to log out because we don't have our UI set up yet. The next function is going to be another client-side function. Let's set the execution space setting to client, and let's name this show dungeon reservation, and we're going to pass in our table of users. So this will just be the way to show our UI initially, and then the final function we're going to have is our hide dungeon reservation, and simply we're just going to call hide on our instance dungeon UI. So let's add a property up here, and let's set this to a component, and we'll name this component instance dungeon reservation UI, and we're going to set that to our model instance dungeon. So that will reference this entity right here, and specifically this component that it's attached. Okay, so we have our bridge into our UI through our UI manager. So this will be the only functions that can be called directly by utilizing these two functions here. The final thing we're going to do is let's open up our dynamic map portal that we created last time, and let's add to it. So we already have our portal use event, but this time instead of enter instance dungeon, we're gonna leave that out. We're gonna actually use the portal user value here, which will give us the entity of the portal user. And we're going to create another function up here called use portal that will take in a parameter of a string user ID. And we're going to set this as a client-side execution space, and we're simply going to call our show dungeon reservation function from our UI manager. Let's double check because it looks like I spelled something wrong. Maybe I did. Sorry, we don't need that second parameter. Okay, so we're going to call show dungeon reservation with an empty table, because the first time we open our UI, we always want to have an empty table until the players decide to search for a party using the register button and enter into the party. So when we use this portal, we're going to call show dungeon reservation to open up our UI. So we're just going to grab the user ID from the player component of the portal user, and we're going to pass that into the use portal function. Then we're going to show our dungeon reservation. The next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to listen in on the player registered event. So right here, this is when the user clicks on this register button. So this, remember when we sent this event, we sent this to the local player. So we have to listen on the local player to actually receive this event. We're going to set this function, execution space setting, to client only, because we know that our event, when it's sent from our UI, is going to be a client-side event. So there's no reason and there's no way for this event to be called from the server side. So we're just going to set that to client only. And we're going to grab the values that we are going to be receiving and we're going to check if the isRegistered value is true. If the isRegistered value is true, then we're going to toggle the user off, meaning we're going to leave the party because this button has been clicked while the user is in a party and we want to leave it now because we're toggling it off. If it's false, then that means that the user has not been added to a party yet and now wants to be part of a party. So we're going to call reserve map. So let's define both of these functions here. 1, 2. The first one is going to be reserve map. And we're going to set this execution space setting as a server-side method because this is going to be called from our server. And we're going to call our scene management reserve dynamic map. So this is, remember, this is a server-side function, so we're calling this from the server. So from our client-side method here, we're sending this to the server and we're calling from the server our reserve dynamic map. So we will need a parameter, add parameter of our string user ID. And it looks like I have named this incorrectly. This should be scene management. Similarly, we're going to add our unreserved map function, and we're going to add a parameter of the string user ID, and we're going to call scene management unregistered map, and we're going to pass in our map name and the user ID that we're passing in. So both of these have been set up here, and this should be, this should be registered and not is registered. And the other thing we're going to do is we're also going to listen in when the enter button is clicked. So we're going to listen for the player enter dungeon event. So again, when we sent this from our UI, right here, we've sent this to the local player. So inside of our portal, we also have to listen for the local player to actually receive this event. And in here, we're going to call enter reservation. And this is not a function that we defined yet, but let's define that right now. Let's create another function up here, new, and let's name this enter reservation. And this will again be a server-side function. Execution space setting server, because we're going to call our server-side scene management functions for this. So the logic here, we're going to call scene management find instance name. So we're going to pass in our map name and our sender user ID. So this will be a parameter that is automatically retrieved when we call a server-side function from a client. So when the server receives a request to call a function from the client, it will know which client has called the server-side function. So that's what the sender user ID will keep track of, is which client called this function. So we're going to pass in the map name and the sender user ID to find the instance name of the dynamic map. If that dynamic map exists, then we're going to get a list of all of the reserved users that have reserved this map. And we're going to check if the current user exists within this user table, meaning that we are actually registered in this table. Then we're going to enter the reservation by calling scene management move reservations to map. So we're going to move all of the users that have reserved this map into the dynamic map. And then we're going to close the UI, so hide dungeon reservation in our UI manager. We're going to close the UI for each user. Remember, again, this is going to target specific users because we're passing in this dungeon reservation, even though our UI manager doesn't actually have a parameter. And this is again because when we call a client-side function from the server, it takes in the target user ID. Speaking of, we'll make sure to set this execution space setting to client. We had forgotten to do that. And if this reserve map does not exist yet, that means that there's no reservation and there's no users that have registered for this map. So it's just going to show the pop-up no registered users. Again, this is just going to be a log to the console, but if this were fully implemented, this would actually be a pop-up that appears so that the user can be notified that there has been an issue because there's no registered users in this map and we cannot enter a reservation yet. The final thing we're going to handle is when a player leaves the map while registered. So we're going to search for the user leave event, and we need the user ID, and we're simply going to call unreserved map with the user ID. So again, unreserved map is just going to call unregistered dynamic map based on the user ID. Okay, and that should be it. The final thing we're going to do is make sure that we are setting the proper execution space setting for this, which should be client only, because we know this enter dungeon event is only going to be called from the client side because the sender is the client side sender. Okay, we're almost done. We've set up most of the client-side stuff with our UI, and we also have our dynamic portal updated with our new behavior. So if you look at our portal, we're going to make sure that our dynamic portal is actually attached to this portal. So something you have to remember to do if you're not following up from the previous time we went over dynamic maps, to make sure that you create a portal and you attach our dynamic portal script component to that portal so that it actually functions. The final thing we're going to do is we have also inside of our map, if we enter here, we have our Yeti boss. And our Yeti boss has an instance dungeon monster component. So if we double click, last time we had said on boss end, so this would be when the boss is defeated and we move the players back into the first map. And we're grabbing a list of all the players that are currently in the map and we're returning them to the return map on defeat, which is fine. We don't necessarily have to update this, but just to make sure, because there may be other bosses that do a similar behavior, and if we want to do some more complex behaviors before we leave this map, it's better to have that logic in one place, and we've already defined that in scene management, where we did close dynamic map. So what we're going to do in instance dungeon monster is here where it says set timer once, and we have the logic to move the players back. We're going to remove this right there. And instead, we're simply going to call scene management close dynamic map. And we're going to pass in the current map name, which is going to be the dynamic map instance. So current map name, and pass in the self.return map on defeat. And this way, we have the map exit logic in one place, which is this function here. And with that, that's it. Let's go back into our first map here, into our main map. Let's hit save. And let's make sure inside of our portal that we set the max player value. So for this example, let's set this to 2 players. And then if we press play, oops, we'll hop into our UI and we'll make sure that this is disabled when you first play, so that it's enabled after you use the portal. So if we press up, we can see that this UI appears and we are able to search for a party. So we're going to search for a party, no party exists, so it's going to create a new party for us and add us into that. And if we add another virtual player, and if we try to search for a party, it's going to find this party that I first created with my other user, and it's going to add me to that party. Let's say I close this UI now. It's going to know that I've closed that because remember we sent that event when the map is closed on hide, or when this UI is closed on hide, and it's going to remove me from the list of players by toggling off. So if I search for the party again, we can see that it's there. If we add another player, so remember our max player count is 2. So what happens if we have a third player? So I'm going to enter here and it says search party. If I search for this party, it's already full. So if we search party now, instead of adding me to the existing party, I've been sent into my own party. And if I, let's say, leave with this player, so I'll close this. Notice how this UI has been updated with the new player list, and the server handles all of that. And if I leave my party, and if I search for the party again, we can see that I'm now added into this party. And if I add myself and search for a party again, we can see that I'm now being added to my own party because this previous party is full. Same behavior happened on player leave. So if I leave this player, we can see the same behavior happens as if I've left by closing this window. If I leave the party and I enter the party again, we can see that I'm added to this existing party. If I press the virtual player again, one more time, and let's add myself to a party. And if I click enter, the first two, so this client and this client, should enter. And we've entered into this dungeon together. And this player is entering its own instance of this dynamic map. So we have two separate dynamic dungeons running. And let's say I defeat the Yeti with these two players. These two players have completed and are returned back to the starting static map. But I'm still fighting this Yeti, and I have to defeat my own dynamic map instance and clear it to be returned to the static map. So that is the full setup for creating a party system and entering and leaving dynamic maps. And that's all for today. Today we've gone over a sample of a dungeon party system. We've taken a step-by-step into the implementation of my version of the system that utilizes dynamic maps, but please take time to understand the code and improve on the systems that I've shown you today. Thanks for joining me today, and I can't wait to see how you all implement this type of dynamic map system into your own worlds. Happy creating!